Hallway rules are simple. Keep your head down, get to class, hope the bell saves you. Most days, the loudest kids write the script and everyone else pretends not to hear. This time their joke had a target, a girl moving slower than the crowd, one hand on a crutch and the other clutching her books. The shove came first, the snickers next, phones already half raised for a laugh. And then the footsteps behind them stopped. A shadow fell across the lockers, and when the girl looked up, Jason Statham was already kneeling beside her, calm, steady. While the hallway's noise drained into a silence none of them had ever heard before. And before they noticed what was going on, Jason Statham taught them a lesson they would never forget. Before we continue, to everyone who's been part of this journey, thank you. Your support, your comments, your time, and your hearts keep these stories alive. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Every story we share has a meaning. It's about kindness, courage, and standing up when it matters most. If this story touches you, please subscribe, drop a comment, and share it with someone who still believes that doing the right thing can change everything. It was just another Monday morning in Brookshire High. The kind where the fluorescent lights buzzed above tired heads, the smell of cheap coffee drifted down the hall, and teachers' voices echoed about missing homework and tardy slips. Students shuffled past lockers in half-sleep, earbuds in, backpacks dragging behind them. For most kids, the day had already blurred into routine. But for Sophie Carter, it was a different kind of morning, one that began like every other, but one she'd soon wish she could erase. Sophie was 12, small for her age, with a soft voice and a limp that made her walk slower than the rest. A car accident 2 years ago had left her right leg permanently weakened, forcing her to use a single metal crutch to move around. It wasn't something she liked to draw attention to, she just wanted to blend in. But at a school like Brookshire, blending in was a luxury she didn't have. "Move it, hop along," a voice jeered behind her. The words hit her before she even turned. Her shoulders tensed. She didn't need to look to know who it was, Tyler Briggs, flanked as always by his two shadows, Logan and Bryce. They were the kind of boys who thought being loud made them powerful and that laughter made cruelty okay. Sophie tried to step aside, clutching her books tightly. "Sorry," she murmured, not wanting trouble. But that apology was all the invitation they needed. "Sorry," Tyler smirked. "You should be, you're holding up traffic." He swung his backpack, clipping her elbow. Her books scattered across the floor, math, science, a small worn notebook she always kept hidden under the others. The notebook slid across the hall and stopped by a pair of boots, heavy, dark, clean. The boots didn't move. Sophie bent to reach for her books, but Tyler kicked one aside. "Oops," he said, chuckling. "Didn't see that there." Students nearby pretended to be busy, tying their shoes, checking their phones, ducking into classrooms. No one wanted to get involved. That was the unspoken rule. Sophie's fingers trembled as she reached for the crutch that had clattered to the floor. But before she could grab it, Tyler's sneaker came down on the metal, pinning it in place. "Say please," he sneered. The laughter echoed through the hallway like a bad memory on repeat. And that's when another sound cut through it, slow, deliberate footsteps. Tyler frowned, glancing up. The man was tall, built like he'd been carved from stone, his expression unreadable. He wore a black jacket, simple jeans, and carried no backpack, definitely not a teacher, and definitely not a parent. It was Jason Statham. He had come that morning for something simple, to visit the principal about a charity program he was sponsoring for local schools. His foundation often helped kids from difficult backgrounds, but as he rounded that corner, the meeting suddenly didn't matter. Because what he saw in that moment, the small girl on the floor, her books scattered, her crutch trapped under a sneaker, was something he couldn't walk past. The hallway went quiet, but Tyler didn't seem to notice who was standing there. "You deaf too?" Tyler said. "I said say. Move your foot." The voice was low, calm, controlled. Tyler turned, smirking. "Who are you, dude?" Jason didn't answer. He just looked at the boy, his gaze steady, like he was weighing the air around him. "You've got 5 seconds to move your foot before you regret not listening." For a moment no one spoke. The hallway seemed to shrink, every eye, every whisper drawn into the stillness around that man. Tyler laughed awkwardly. "Okay, what are you, some kind of bodyguard?" He stepped forward, puffing his chest. "This is none of your business." Jason tilted his head slightly. When you hurt someone who can't fight back, it becomes everyone's business. He stepped closer, and even though he didn't raise his voice, the authority in it made Tyler instinctively step back. The crutch was freed. Sophie quickly grabbed it and used the lockers to steady herself. Jason crouched beside her, picking up her notebook. The cover was scuffed, with her name scribbled in blue pen. He handed it to her gently. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her eyes shimmered with tears. "I'm fine," she whispered. But Jason could see the small tremor in her hands. She wasn't fine. Behind them, Logan tried to whisper something to Bryce, but Jason's sharp glance silenced both. "Apologize," he said, his tone even. Tyler scoffed. "What? No way, man." Jason straightened up slowly. "You think being cruel makes you strong?" Tyler didn't answer, but his defiance cracked as Jason took a step forward. "Strength isn't about size or noise," Jason continued. "It's about knowing when to stop. You should try learning that before life teaches you the hard way." The crowd that had been pretending not to watch was now completely silent. Even a teacher who'd come out of her classroom stood frozen, unsure if she should step in. Jason finally turned back to Sophie. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you to the nurse. That leg doesn't look great." She hesitated. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble," she murmured. Jason gave her a faint smile. Some people need to be in trouble before they understand right from wrong. He helped her down the hall. Students moved aside like a wave parting. Tyler and his friends just stood there, pale and quiet. For once, they didn't have a comeback. In the nurse's office, Jason stayed by Sophie's side while the nurse checked her leg. It was bruised but not broken. Still, Jason's jaw tightened as he listened to Sophie explain what had happened, how this wasn't the first time, how the teachers didn't really see anything. Jason leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So they've been doing this a while?" Sophie nodded. "I just try to ignore it. My mom says if I keep my head down, they'll get bored." Jason exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Ignoring bullies doesn't make them stop, Sophie. It just makes them think they're right." When the nurse finished, Jason asked for the principal's office. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but the quiet intensity in his eyes said everything. Principal Harris was a kind man, though often overwhelmed. He looked startled when Jason Statham walked in with Sophie by his side. "Mr. Statham," Harris began, standing up, "I wasn't expecting." Jason held up a hand. "Save it. We'll get to the reason I came later. Right now we're talking about her." Harris blinked. "Of course, what happened?" Jason looked at Sophie, giving her a nod of reassurance. Slowly, she explained. Every word trembled, but she didn't stop. When she finished, the room felt colder. Harris frowned deeply. "Tyler Briggs, I've had complaints before. His father's on the school board, so there's been, well, complications." Jason's jaw tightened. "So you let him keep hurting people?" Harris hesitated. "It's not that simple, Mr. Statham." Jason's voice dropped, calm but firm. "It's exactly that simple. You either protect your students or you don't." There was something in his tone, not anger but conviction. The kind that didn't come from ego but from experience. After a moment, Harris nodded. "I'll take care of it, I promise." Jason turned to Sophie. "You hear that?" She nodded softly. "Good," he said, "because people like that only win when others stay quiet, and you've been quiet long enough." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before leaving the office. That evening, the story spread faster than wildfire. Students whispered about the man who shut Tyler up, and the look on his face when he realized who it was. Videos began circulating online, showing Jason walking Sophie down the hall while everyone else just stared. For Sophie, the next morning felt different. Students who'd never spoken to her before stopped to say hello. Some apologized for not helping. The teachers, too, seemed more attentive, watching the halls more closely. But the biggest change came when the principal made an announcement over the intercom. "Effective immediately," his voice echoed, "any act of bullying will result in suspension. No exceptions, no excuses." It wasn't just policy, it was a warning. And in that moment, Sophie realized something powerful. Kindness could ripple just as far as cruelty if someone brave enough started the wave. Later that week, Jason returned to the school not as a hero, but as a mentor. He sat with Sophie in the cafeteria, surrounded by students who now looked at her with respect instead of pity. "You doing all right?" he asked. She smiled shyly, better than before. He nodded. "That's what matters, but remember you don't owe anyone silence, ever." Sophie looked at him, eyes bright. "Thank you for standing up for me." Jason gave a small, warm grin. "No, Sophie, you stood up for yourself. I just made sure they noticed." By the end of the week, Tyler and his friends were suspended pending review. Parents were called, meetings were held, and for once the school board didn't sweep it under the rug, not when half the city had seen the video. Jason's act didn't just defend one girl. It forced an entire community to look at what they'd been ignoring. And for Sophie Carter, that day marked the first time she walked through those halls not as the girl with the crutch, but as the girl who stood up, survived, and changed everything. The week after the incident at Brookshire High was one the town wouldn't forget anytime soon. Parents whispered about it over coffee, teachers discussed it behind closed doors, and for the first time, the students realized that bullying wasn't just part of school life. It had consequences, and those consequences now had a face. Jason Statham didn't plan to become part of the story. He had walked into that school to talk about funding after-school programs and mentorship projects for at-risk youth. But life, as he knew too well, didn't follow scripts. Sometimes, the right fight found you. And when it did, you didn't walk away. The morning after, Jason pulled into the school parking lot again, this time invited by Principal Harris, who wanted to speak privately. The sun had barely risen, and the asphalt still glistened from a night of rain. As Jason stepped out of his black SUV, the door to the front office opened, and Harris waved him in nervously. "Mr. Statham, thank you for coming," Harris said, extending a hand. He looked tired, as if he'd barely slept. "I wanted to tell you we've begun disciplinary proceedings for those boys. Their parents weren't happy, but after what happened, we couldn't ignore it." Jason nodded slightly. "Good, but punishment's not enough." Harris blinked. "Not enough." Jason leaned forward. "You can't fix a problem by sending 3 kids home. You've got to change the culture that lets it happen." The principal sat back, considering. Jason's tone wasn't accusatory, it was practical, grounded in something deeper than anger. "You've got to teach the rest of them what respect looks like," Jason continued. "Not through rules, but through example. The teachers, the staff, the students, they all need to know what standing up for someone looks like." Harris nodded slowly. "You're right. I think I was afraid to admit how deep it goes. I kept hoping things would sort themselves out." Jason looked him in the eye. "They never do, not until someone decides enough is enough." For a long moment the room was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy but necessary. Then Harris sighed and said, "Would you consider speaking to the students? About what happened, I mean." Jason hesitated. He didn't like attention. He wasn't a man who chased cameras or crowds. But when he thought about Sophie, the small, brave girl who'd smiled despite the bruises, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'll do it." By noon, the entire school was gathered in the gymnasium. Folding chairs filled the space, and the usual chatter was replaced by whispers of anticipation. Teachers stood along the walls, and even the seniors, who normally rolled their eyes at anything motivational, looked curious. When Jason stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent instantly. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, scanning the faces, hundreds of them, young and uncertain. Then, in that calm, measured voice that somehow carried to the farthest corners of the gym, he said, "You all saw what happened last week." A ripple of movement went through the audience. Nods, murmurs, uneasy glances. Jason continued, "I'm not here to talk about punishment. I'm here to talk about choice." He took a slow step forward. "Every day, each of you makes choices. What to wear, who to talk to, what to post online. But there's another choice you make, one that defines who you are, and that's what you do when you see something wrong." He paused, because doing nothing is still a choice. The words landed like a weight. Some students looked down, others fidgeted. "I've been in a lot of fights in my life," Jason said, pacing slightly. "Some I won, some I didn't. But the hardest ones weren't the physical ones. They were the ones where I had to decide whether to walk away or to stand up for someone else." He turned toward the students seated near the front, Sophie among them. Courage isn't about throwing punches. It's about protecting the people who can't fight back. It's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching. The gym was so quiet now that even the creak of the bleachers echoed. Jason let his words settle before adding softly, "Sophie didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does, but she showed something that the bullies never had: strength. She stood up even when everyone else looked away. And that's what real strength looks like." Sophie lowered her head slightly, embarrassed but smiling. Jason nodded toward the principal. "You've got a good school here, but it's only as good as the people who choose to make it safe. So I want to challenge you, every one of you, to be that person. Don't wait for someone like me to walk in. Be the one who steps up." When he finished, there was silence. Then one by one, students began to clap. It wasn't the usual polite applause. It grew deeper, louder, until the entire gym was on its feet. Even Harris, standing off to the side, wiped the corner of his eye. After the assembly, Sophie caught up with Jason near the exit. She was wearing a new brace, lighter, smaller, and though she still limped, her step seemed more confident. "You didn't have to do that," she said shyly. "Talk to everyone, I mean." Jason smiled faintly. "I didn't have to, but sometimes people need to hear what silence hides." Sophie nodded, clutching her backpack straps. "They've been nicer now. Even Tyler's friends said sorry." Jason raised an eyebrow. "And Tyler?" She hesitated. "He didn't say much, but I think he's different. He looked scared." Jason gave a low chuckle. "Fear's a good start, but change comes when he feels shame and decides to do something about it." They walked a few steps toward the parking lot. Sophie glanced up at him. "Why did you help me?" Jason looked ahead. "Because once someone helped me." Her eyes widened slightly. "Really?" He nodded. "Yeah, I wasn't much older than you. Thought the world was against me. Then someone showed me that the world only changes when you decide to fight for what's right. Been trying to pay that lesson forward ever since." Sophie smiled. "I think you did." Jason placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "No, Sophie, you did. You stood back up. That's what people will remember." 2 weeks later, life at Brookshire began to settle into something new, something better. The school started a Courage program, a weekly initiative where students could anonymously report bullying, volunteer for mentoring, and share acts of kindness. Teachers noticed fewer incidents, and kids who used to stay invisible began to speak up. Sophie became somewhat of a quiet hero. She didn't like the attention, but she liked the change. People no longer saw her limp first, they saw her smile. Even Tyler, suspended and sent to counseling, came back different. He avoided eye contact for days, but one afternoon, he approached Sophie outside the library. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what I did." Sophie looked at him, unsure if she should respond. He wasn't smirking this time. His voice shook and his eyes were red like someone who hadn't slept. "I thought it was funny," he continued. "But when I saw the video, when I saw you crying, I realized it was just cruel." Sophie nodded, still cautious. "Don't say sorry to me, just don't do it to anyone else." He nodded quickly. "Yeah, I won't." Then after a pause he added, "You're tougher than I thought." She smiled slightly. "I know." That night Jason sat in his car outside the diner where it had all started, the place he'd first stopped on his way through town. The waitress recognized him instantly. "You're the guy from the news," she said, pouring his coffee. "The one who helped that girl at the school." Jason smiled. "I just happened to be there." The waitress shook her head. "Maybe, but sometimes being there is all it takes." Jason thought about that as he sipped his coffee. The world was full of quiet battles, ones no camera ever caught. Sometimes it was a shove in a hallway. Sometimes a cruel word whispered in passing. But every one of those moments was a chance, a test of what kind of person you chose to be. He looked out the window at the rain, starting to fall again. Most people walked through life hoping for peace. But sometimes peace wasn't found, it was earned, by standing between the hurt and the innocent, by choosing kindness when anger was easier. And that, he thought, was the real fight. A few months later, Sophie received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the school, it was from Jason. Inside was a small silver coin engraved with the words, "Strength is quiet until it's needed." And beneath it a short note. Sophie never stopped standing up, no matter how hard it gets. The world changes one brave person at a time. Jason. She held the coin tightly in her palm, feeling its weight. For the first time in her life, she didn't see herself as broken. She saw herself as brave. And as she walked down the school hallway the next morning, head high, smile steady, everyone who passed her noticed the change. Not in her limp, not in her stride, but in her eyes. Because courage, once found, never really leaves you. It becomes part of who you are. Later that day, Principal Harris announced that Brookshire High had been selected as one of the new partner schools for Jason Statham's Stand Up Foundation, a program designed to empower young students to combat bullying through empathy, mentorship, and strength. The applause that followed wasn't just for the celebrity who inspired it. It was for Sophie, for every student who had once stayed quiet, and for a community that had finally learned to speak up. Jason didn't attend the ceremony. He didn't need to. His lesson had already taken root in every heart that understood what it meant to stand up when others couldn't. And so, what began as a moment of cruelty in a school hallway became something greater, a ripple of change that reached far beyond one girl, one classroom, one day. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to look away, to turn a moment of pain into a movement of strength. And that, in the end, is exactly what Jason Statham did.